On a freezing night, a cop is about to end his shift when two tiny black twin girls tug at his leg, barefoot and shivering. "Help! Our Nana fell," one whispers. He follows them into a dark alley and finds an elderly woman collapsed on the pavement. But as he checks for a pulse, his heart stops. He knows her. Decades ago, she saved him. Now she's the one who needs saving, and the twins have no one but him. What happens next will change all their lives forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The dashboard clock cast a pale green glow across Derek Patterson's tired face, 11:47 p.m. Another mind-numbing shift was crawling to its end. He sat in his squad car, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights of the empty gas station, and pressed his fingers against his throbbing temples. The familiar scent of stale coffee from his third cup lingered in the car, a reminder of how long this shift had dragged on. 13 minutes. Just 13 more minutes and he could go home to his empty apartment, microwave some leftover pizza, and try to forget another day of meaningless paperwork and petty crimes. The thought of his cold, quiet apartment wasn't exactly comforting, but at least it was familiar. The radio crackled with static, but no calls came through. These late-night shifts in November were usually quiet, too cold for most troublemakers to bother. His breath fogged up the window as he reached for his cigarettes. Bad habit, he knew, but tonight he needed something to take the edge off. The pack was nearly empty, just like his patience. Derek's weathered hands cupped the flame of his lighter, illuminating the deep creases around his eyes that made him look older than his 38 years. The first drag of smoke filled his lungs, and he exhaled slowly, watching the gray wisps dance in the frigid air. Each breath carried away another piece of the day's tension. 15 years on the force had changed him. He barely recognized himself anymore. That idealistic rookie who thought he could make a difference was long gone, replaced by someone who just went through the motions. Violence, paperwork, repeat. Nothing ever really changed. The weight of countless similar nights pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't shed. A shadow flickered near the corner of the gas station building. Derek's eyes narrowed automatically, but he dismissed it as probably just another stray cat. This part of town had plenty of them. Still, years of experience had taught him to keep watching just in case. He checked the dashboard clock again, 11:54 p.m. The cigarette was almost done, its orange glow reflecting off the frost-covered windshield. Derek tapped the ash onto the pavement outside his open window and reached for his keys, ready to call it a night. The metal felt cold against his fingers as he fumbled with the keyring. Just as the key slid into the ignition, something tugged at his pant leg. His body tensed instantly, years of training kicking in as his hand instinctively moved toward his weapon. But when he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. The cigarette slipped from his fingers, forgotten. Two tiny faces stared up at him, illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. Black twin girls, couldn't be more than 3 years old, stood shivering beside his car door. They wore matching pink pajamas, far too thin for the freezing temperature, and their small feet were completely bare on the ice-cold pavement. Their dark curls were slightly matted, as if they'd just gotten out of bed. Derek's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The smaller of the twins had her tiny fist wrapped in the fabric of his uniform pants, while her sister hung back slightly, thumb firmly planted in her mouth, eyes wide with fear. Their shoulders trembled with each breath in the cold night air. He slowly crouched down, trying to make his bulk less intimidating. His voice came out rougher than he intended, but he kept it steady and controlled. "Where are your parents?" The words felt heavy in the quiet night. The braver twin, the one still gripping his pants, whispered so softly he had to lean in to hear. "Help. Our Nana fell." Her voice quivered like a leaf in the wind. Something in their eyes made his chest tighten. Pure, raw fear. The kind he'd seen too many times in his career, the kind that always meant trouble. Derek scanned the empty street, looking for any sign of an adult, a guardian, anyone who might be responsible for these children. But there was nothing. Just darkness, cold, and two terrified little girls. The streetlights cast long shadows across the deserted parking lot. His shift was over. Protocol said he should call it in. Let dispatch handle it. Someone else's problem now. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way they trembled, or how their small toes had turned slightly blue from the cold. The sight stirred something deep inside him, something he thought he'd buried years ago. Derek stood up slowly, letting out a heavy breath that clouded in the night air. His gut was screaming that this was serious. "Show me," he said simply. The words came out before he could second-guess himself. The twins immediately latched onto his hands, their tiny fingers ice-cold against his skin. Without hesitation, they pulled him toward the dark alley behind the gas station. Their grip was surprisingly strong for such small children, as if they were afraid he might disappear if they let go. Derek followed the twins through the dark alley, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Their tiny bare feet made soft pattering sounds against the wet pavement, and his heart clenched at how cold they must be. The narrow passage behind the church was littered with soggy newspapers and crushed cans, the air heavy with the sharp smell of rain-soaked concrete and rotting garbage. Distant thunder rumbled overhead, threatening more rain. "Nana, Nana," the bolder twin whispered, tugging his hand harder. Her sister kept pace, thumb firmly in mouth, dark eyes wide with fear. Their matching pink pajamas were already damp from the drizzle, the cartoon unicorns faded and worn. The beam of his flashlight caught something ahead, a crumpled form on the ground. Derek's breath caught in his throat as he quickened his pace, careful not to outrun the little girls, still gripping his fingers with surprising strength. There, beneath a flickering street lamp, lay an elderly black woman. She was face up on the wet pavement, her thin gray hair spread around her head like a halo. Her eyes were closed, skin ashen in the dim light. She wore a simple floral house dress and a worn cardigan, both soaked through from the damp ground. "Ma'am?" Derek called sharply, dropping to one knee beside her. His fingers found her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak and thready, but present. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. The sight stirred something deep inside him, a memory of another night long ago when someone else had needed help. The twins pressed against his side, whimpering. "Nana," they cried softly, reaching small hands to touch her arm. Their identical faces were pinched with worry, too young to fully understand, but old enough to know something was terribly wrong. Derek's jaw clenched as he studied the scene. This wasn't just another call, not just another faceless victim to process and forget. These little girls trusted him to help, their eyes full of desperate hope as they looked up at him. The weight of their trust settled heavy on his shoulders. He could radio it in and step back. Let the system handle it. His shift was over anyway. That's what procedure dictated. Maintain professional distance, follow protocol. But something made him stay. Maybe it was the way the twins huddled together, or how fragile the old woman looked against the harsh concrete. Or maybe it was the echo of his own past, calling him to action. "Dispatch, this is Patterson," he said into his radio, voice gruff. "I need an ambulance at the alley behind First Baptist on Mason Street. Elderly female, unconscious but breathing. Priority response requested." While waiting for response, he carefully checked the woman's pockets for ID. Her wallet revealed her name, Delilah Carter, age 68. The twins watched his every move, their small bodies shivering in their thin pajamas. Their eyes never left his face, as if drawing strength from his calm presence. Derek shrugged off his police jacket and gently laid it over Delilah's still form. The fabric seemed to swallow her slight frame. Despite its size, he could see it offered little warmth against the chill night air. "Come on," he muttered, more prayer than command. "Don't do this. These little ones need you." The wail of approaching sirens split the night air. Soon, flashlight beams danced down the alley as paramedics hurried toward them with a stretcher. Their urgent voices and quick movements brought a strange comfort. Help was finally here. Everything moved quickly then. Vital signs checked, IV started, Delilah's limp body carefully transferred to the stretcher. The twins began to cry in earnest as the paramedics wheeled their grandmother toward the waiting ambulance. Their small shoulders shook with each sob. "Officer," one of the EMTs called, "do you know the victim? Or these children?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications about procedure and protocol. Derek looked down at the little girls now clinging to his uniform pants, their faces streaked with tears as they watched the ambulance doors close on their grandmother. Their trust in him was absolute, their need for protection clear in every trembling line of their small bodies. In their eyes, he saw the same fear and uncertainty he'd once felt himself. He hesitated only a moment before answering. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, then bent to scoop up both twins. They immediately wrapped their arms around his neck, holding on tight as he carried them to his squad car. Their warm tears soaked into his shoulder, but he didn't mind. Sometimes, he realized, doing the right thing meant going beyond the call of duty. The ambulance bay doors burst open, flooding the night with harsh fluorescent light. Derek jogged alongside the gurney, his uniform jacket still draped over Delilah's frail form. The twins clutched his hands, their tiny fingers ice-cold against his skin, their footsteps quick and unsteady as they tried to keep up with the rushing medical team. "BP's dropping," a paramedic called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Need to get her stabilized. Heart rate's irregular." The smell of antiseptic hit Derek's nose as they entered the emergency room, the sharp scent making his eyes water. Everything felt too bright, too sterile, too urgent. Mia and Tia pressed against his legs, their eyes wide with fear as medical staff swarmed around their grandmother like busy bees around a hive. "Sir, you'll need to wait outside," a nurse said firmly, her scrubs rustling as she tried to guide Derek and the girls away from the treatment room. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across her concerned face. "I'm staying," Derek growled, then caught himself as he felt the twins flinch. He softened his voice, remembering the scared children beside him. I'm the responding officer. These are her grandchildren, they have nobody else right now." The next hour crawled by like molasses in winter. Derek paced the hallway outside Delilah's room, his boots squeaking against the polished floor, counting steps to keep his mind occupied. Every few steps he'd glance at the twins who had curled up together on the waiting room chairs like two small cats seeking comfort in each other. Their eyes fought sleep, but fear kept them awake, their small bodies twitching at every loud noise or sudden movement in the corridor. As he watched the medical team working on Delilah through the glass window, something tugged at his memory like an insistent child pulling at his sleeve. The way she lay there, so still and vulnerable, stirred something deep inside him, and then it hit him like a thunderbolt. 30 years ago, a grocery store parking lot on a cold autumn evening. The taste of copper penny blood in his mouth, the rough asphalt scraping against his cheek. His father's voice, slurred with anger and alcohol, cutting through the evening air. "Get up, you worthless piece of—" But then, cutting through the fog of pain and fear like a beam of sunlight, a woman's voice. "That's enough." The words had rung with quiet authority. He remembered looking up through swollen eyes, seeing a tall black woman standing between him and his father, her silhouette backlit by the store's flickering lights. Her voice had been quiet, but carried steel underneath like velvet over iron. "Step away from that boy," she had said, her hand firm on his father's arm, her fingers digging into his jacket sleeve. "The police are on their way." The parking lot lights had caught the silver cross at her throat. His father had tried to argue, but something in her eyes made him back down, made him shuffle away into the darkness. Derek remembered how she had knelt beside him afterward, her touch gentle as she checked his injuries, her hands warm against his cold skin. "You're going to be okay, child," she had whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." The promise in those words had carried him through countless dark nights afterward. That woman had been Delilah Carter. She had saved him that day, given him a chance at a different life when he'd needed it most. And now here she was, fighting for her life while her granddaughters watched with terrified eyes, their small worlds hanging by a thread. Derek gripped the hospital railing until his knuckles turned white, the metal cold and unyielding under his fingers. His mind spun with the weight of this realization, this cosmic circle closing after 3 decades. If Delilah didn't pull through? He looked back at Mia and Tia, their small bodies curled together like quotation marks, their matching pink barrettes catching the fluorescent light. What would happen to them? Through the window, he could see Delilah's face, peaceful despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her like a mechanical garden. The steady beep of machines marked each precious heartbeat, a rhythm he found himself breathing to. Derek moved closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface in small clouds. "You saved me once," he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with emotion. "It's my turn now. I promise." The emergency room buzzed with urgent activity as medical staff swarmed around Delilah's gurney. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, her skin looked almost gray, her chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Derek stood back, one hand on each twin's shoulder, as doctors called out vital signs and medical terms he barely understood. The antiseptic smell and constant beeping of monitors filled his senses. "Core temperature dangerously low," a doctor announced, her voice sharp with concern. "Get warming blankets in here now, and someone check those blood pressure readings again." The twins pressed closer to Derek's legs, their small bodies trembling against him like frightened birds. He could feel their fear radiating through their thin pajamas, still damp from the cold night air. Tia's thumb was firmly planted in her mouth, while Mia's eyes never left her grandmother's still form, tracking every movement of the medical team. A nurse approached them, her face kind but worried, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Sir, we need to know if she has any medical conditions or takes any medications. Anything at all could be important right now." Derek shook his head, feeling helpless. "I don't..." He looked down at the girls, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Do you know if Nana takes any medicine?" They just stared back at him with wide, frightened eyes, huddling closer together beneath his hands. "Severe dehydration," another doctor called out from Delilah's bedside. "Starting IV fluids. Get me a warming catheter, and let's get those labs rushed." The automatic doors whooshed open, and a woman in a crisp gray pantsuit strode in, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking purposefully on the linoleum floor. Derek recognized the look immediately: social services. His grip on the girl's shoulders tightened instinctively, his police instincts kicking in. "Officer Patterson?" The social worker's voice was professionally detached, practiced. "I'm Linda Matthews from Child Protective Services. I understand we have 2 minors without a guardian." The twins pressed even closer to Derek's legs, nearly hiding behind him now. He could feel their tiny fingers digging into his uniform pants, their grip desperate and afraid. "Their grandmother's right there," Derek said firmly, nodding toward Delilah's bed, where machines continued their steady rhythm of beeps and hums. "Who's currently unconscious and in critical condition?" Matthews replied, her tone matter-of-fact. She consulted her clipboard, flipping through pages. "We'll need to place them in emergency foster care. Unfortunately, given their age and the late hour, they'll likely need to go to separate homes tonight. It's just protocol." "No." The word came out before Derek could stop it, sharp and decisive. He looked down at Mia and Tia, their faces filled with trust he hadn't earned but couldn't bear to break. Something fierce and protective surged in his chest. "They're staying with me." Matthews raised an eyebrow, her professional mask slipping slightly. "Officer Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but there are procedures." "I know the procedures," Derek cut in, his voice steady and determined. "I'm a certified emergency placement through the department's foster program. Check your records. It's all there." It was true. He'd gotten certified years ago when the department pushed for more officers to sign up, part of a community outreach initiative. He'd never actually taken in any kids, but the certification was still valid. He'd kept up with the renewals out of habit. Matthews frowned, tapping at her tablet with manicured nails. Even so, taking in 2 trauma cases at once, especially at this hour. "They stay together," Derek said firmly. His voice carried the authority of his badge, but his eyes never left the twins. "They've been through enough tonight. I won't let them be separated." The social worker studied him for a long moment, then sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I'll need to verify your certification and run some quick checks, and there will be a home visit first thing tomorrow morning, no exceptions." Derek nodded, relief flooding through him like a warm wave. He crouched down to the twins' level, meeting their scared eyes. "Where's home?" he asked gently. Where do you and Nana live? We'll need to get some of your things. The girls remained silent, clinging to each other like little shadows. Their eyes darted between him and their grandmother's bed, where doctors were still working frantically, calling out orders and adjusting equipment. Behind him, monitors beeped steadily and medical staff continued their urgent work. But in that moment, looking into those trusting little faces, Derek knew he'd made the right choice. Something deep inside him shifted, like a key turning in a lock. Whatever came next, these girls would not face it alone. He would make sure of that. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital lobby, casting harsh shadows across the worn plastic chairs and faded linoleum floor. Derek sat rigidly, his uniform wrinkled from the long night shift, coffee stains marking his sleeve from hours ago. Beside him, Mia and Tia huddled close, their tiny fingers wrapped tightly around his sleeve like it was a lifeline. Their occasional sniffles were barely audible over the droning TV mounted on the wall, playing some late-night infomercial about miracle kitchen gadgets that nobody was watching. The sharp click of heels against linoleum made Derek look up, his shoulders tensing instinctively. A woman in a crisp charcoal gray suit strode toward them, her face set in professional detachment that seemed practiced and permanent. Her clipboard seemed like a shield between her and the world, a barrier against messy emotions and complicated situations. Officer Patterson? Her voice was clipped, efficient, like a machine processing paperwork. I'm Ms. Hayes from Social Services. Thank you for staying, but we'll take it from here. Derek felt the twins' grip tighten on his sleeve, their small fingers digging in with surprising strength. Tia buried her face against his arm, her dark curls tickling his skin, while Mia stared at Ms. Hayes with wide, fearful eyes that seemed to take up half her face. Where exactly did you find them? Ms. Hayes didn't wait for an answer before continuing, her pen hovering over her forms. Are you related to them in any way? Has their grandmother shown any previous signs of neglect? The questions came rapid fire, each one making Derek's jaw clench tighter until he could feel a headache building. He watched as Ms. Hayes scribbled notes in tight, efficient handwriting, barely glancing at the terrified children beside him who seemed to shrink with each word. No signs of neglect, Derek said firmly, his voice carrying a warning edge. They found me. Their grandmother needed help. Ms. Hayes pursed her thin lips, scanning her paperwork with narrowed eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Well, we've run preliminary checks. There are no other known relatives. She adjusted her glasses with one manicured finger. If Ms. Carter doesn't recover, the girls will need to enter the foster system. Given their age, under 3, they'll likely be placed in separate homes. Twins are difficult to place together. Derek's stomach twisted into a tight knot. He looked down at the girls, his chest aching. Mia had dozed off against his arm, her small hand still clutching his sleeve, dark eyelashes fluttering against tear-stained cheeks. Tia watched him with eyes that seemed too old for her young face, filled with a wisdom and fear that no child should possess. What's Delilah's condition? Derek asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. A doctor passing by paused, flipping through his chart with tired eyes. Still critical. The next 24 hours will be crucial. No guarantees at this point. Ms. Hayes nodded briskly, pulling out her phone with practiced efficiency. I'll start making calls for emergency placement. We should have them moved by morning. Derek watched as she stepped away, speaking in low tones about available beds and separation protocols, her heels clicking against the floor like a countdown. His gut churned with growing unease. Everything about this felt wrong, like watching a train wreck in slow motion. These girls had already lost their mother, their grandmother was fighting for her life in the ICU, and now bureaucracy wanted to tear them apart from each other too. Tia's lip trembled as she watched Ms. Hayes, her small body shaking slightly. Even at 3, she seemed to understand what was happening, what those quiet phone calls meant. Derek's fists clenched involuntarily, his knuckles turning white. He knew the system, knew he should step back and let social services handle it. That's what a professional would do. That's what any reasonable person would do. Ms. Hayes returned, tucking her phone away with a sense of finality. Officer Patterson, your shift is over. You're free to go. Derek remained seated, the weight of the twins against his sides holding him in place like anchors. His throat felt tight, constricted with words he couldn't form. Every logical part of his brain told him to stand up, to walk away, to go home to his quiet apartment and forget about this night, about these small lives that had somehow become tangled with his own. He exhaled sharply, his fists still clenched at his sides, knowing he should walk away, but unable to move, trapped between duty and something deeper that he couldn't explain. The hospital parking lot was empty except for a few scattered cars, their surfaces frosted in the bitter midnight air, windshields glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Derek stood with his back straight, muscles tense, the twins pressed against his legs like frightened puppies seeking shelter from a storm. Ms. Hayes pulled her beige coat tighter around her shoulders, her heels clicking sharply on the asphalt as she gestured toward her government-issued sedan, its dull gray paint matching the bleakness of the moment. "The emergency shelter has space for them," she said, her voice clinical and detached, like she was discussing paperwork rather than children's lives. "They'll be processed in the morning." Mia's small face disappeared into the fabric of Derek's jacket, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that tore at his heart. Tia's fingers dug deeper into his sleeve, twisting the material desperately, and her voice came out barely above a whisper, cracking with fear. "Please don't leave us." The words hit Derek like a punch to the gut, leaving him winded and raw. He looked down at their matching pajamas, thin cotton things with little hearts that weren't nearly warm enough for this weather, the fabric worn thin from too many washes. Their bare feet were dirty from running through the alley, small scrapes visible on their ankles. Something inside him shifted, a wall crumbling that he'd built years ago, brick by careful brick. "Officer Patterson," Ms. Hayes said, checking her watch with obvious impatience, the metal catching the parking lot lights. "I know you mean well, but you're not their guardian. The system exists for exactly these situations. We have procedures." Derek's mind raced, memories flashing through his thoughts like lightning. He knew the system all too well. He'd seen too many kids shuffled through it, their eyes growing dimmer with each move, their spirits breaking piece by piece. These girls had already lost too much. The thought of them being separated, scared and alone in different homes, made his chest tight with an almost physical pain. Without a word, he bent down and scooped them up, one in each arm, his movements decisive and gentle. They weighed almost nothing, like two little birds with hollow bones. Mia's arms immediately wrapped around his neck, her grip fierce and trusting while Tia pressed her face into his shoulder, her warm tears seeping through his shirt. "Officer Patterson!" Ms. Hayes' voice rose sharply, echoing across the empty lot. "You can't just take them. This is completely against protocol. Think about what you're doing." Derek turned, his voice low and firm, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Then stop me." Ms. Hayes' mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but she didn't move. Maybe she saw something in his face, something that spoke of protection rather than kidnapping. Or maybe she just didn't want the paperwork that would come with forcing the issue. Either way, she stood frozen as Derek carried the girls to his squad car, their small forms cradled protectively against his chest. He opened the back door, carefully settling them into the seat as if they were made of glass. Their small bodies seemed to relax instantly, tension melting away as if they knew they were safe here, truly safe. For the first time in hours. Derek had no car seats, no supplies, no plan beyond getting them away from here. But he couldn't leave them. He just couldn't. Something fundamental in his soul rebelled at the very thought. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the tires crunching over scattered gravel, he caught Ms. Hayes' frustrated figure in his rearview mirror. She was already on her phone, probably calling her supervisor, her free hand gesturing animatedly in the cold night air. Derek knew there would be consequences, serious ones, but right now, that didn't matter. Nothing mattered, except the precious cargo in his back seat. The car was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional sniffle from the back. In the back seat, the girls huddled together like baby birds in a nest, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but still watching him carefully in the mirror. As they turned onto the main road, streetlights casting alternating shadows through the windows, Tia's sleepy voice drifted forward. "Deck," she murmured, the words slurred with sleep and innocent trust. Derek glanced in the rearview mirror, something warm and unfamiliar spreading in his chest, melting years of carefully maintained distance. He had no idea what he was doing, no blueprint for this impossible situation. But somehow that simple mispronunciation of his name felt right. It felt like the beginning of something important, something that would change all their lives forever. Derek shouldered open his apartment door, juggling two sleepy toddlers. The door groaned, revealing his small one-bedroom apartment. The pale light from the street lamp, peeking through the thin curtains, cast long shadows across the mess. Empty takeout containers and papers lay scattered everywhere. "Home, sweet home," he mumbled, though it felt far from sweet. He looked around his bachelor pad, seeing it with fresh eyes. The thin mattress slumped in the corner, the sheets rumpled and dirty. Dirty dishes piled high in the sink, threatening to topple. His old couch showed mysterious stains he'd never bothered to clean. Tia's head lolled against his shoulder. Mia's tiny fingers gripped his uniform shirt. Both girls were struggling to stay awake, their small bodies warm against him. Derek carefully stepped over the clutter, thankful he'd at least cleared a path to the couch earlier in the week. "Okay, here we are," he said, awkwardly settling them onto the worn cushions. The twins snuggled together, their eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. The apartment felt tiny and inadequate. Tia let out a huge yawn, her little face crumpling. Next to her, Mia rubbed her eyes with small fists, clearly exhausted. Derek ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. They needed blankets, pillows, something soft and comfy to sleep on. He rushed to his bedroom, searching through his few belongings. The best he could find was an old Navy hoodie from his police academy days. Returning to the living room, he found both girls already asleep, nestled together, their breathing slow and even. Derek gently draped the hoodie over them. They didn't stir, completely worn out. In their sleep, their faces looked even younger, more fragile. His heart ached. He went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The harsh light revealed almost empty shelves. 3 beers, a carton of milk long past its expiration date, some questionable takeout containers crammed in the back. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming the door harder than he intended. He quickly checked on the twins. They slept soundly. His mind swirled with everything he lacked. No food, no extra clothes, no blankets. No idea what 3-year-olds even needed. The weight of his rash decision crashed down on him. Derek sat on the couch beside the sleeping twins, being very careful not to wake them. He felt heavy with exhaustion, every muscle aching. He stared at the water-stained ceiling, his thoughts a jumbled mess. What had he done? He was a cop, not a dad. He barely managed to take care of himself. Now, 2 tiny lives depended on him. The reality hit him hard, like a punch to the stomach. A sharp poke to his cheek jolted Derek awake. His police instincts kicked in immediately, body tensing before his eyes even opened. When they did, he found himself staring into 2 identical pairs of big brown eyes. Mia and Tia stood beside the couch where he'd fallen asleep, their tiny faces inches from his, their dark curls creating halos in the early morning light. "Jesus," he muttered, heart racing. Then he saw what Tia held in her small hands, one of his beer cans from the fridge. His stomach dropped, a cold wave of panic washing over him. "No!" He snatched the can away, perhaps too roughly. Tia's lower lip trembled, her small shoulders hunching inward. "Not a toy," he added, trying to soften his voice. That's not for kids. Never touch these, okay?" Mia just blinked at him solemnly, her fingers twisting in the hem of her pajama top, while Tia's face broke into an unexpected giggle. The sound was startlingly sweet in his stark apartment, bouncing off the bare walls like musical notes. Derek pushed himself up from the couch, his neck stiff from the awkward sleeping position. His back protested the movement, reminding him he wasn't 20 anymore. Empty cabinets hung open in his kitchen, evidence of tiny hands at work. They'd clearly been exploring while he slept. Cereal boxes were scattered across his counter, their contents spilled everywhere like edible confetti. Hungry? He asked, though it was obvious from the mess they'd made searching for food. His head throbbed with the beginning of a headache. He hadn't had kids in his apartment. Ever. What did 3-year-olds even eat? The parenting books he should have read might as well have been novels in Chinese. The fridge offered no help, just condiments, beer, and something furry in a takeout container he didn't dare investigate. The smell alone made him slam the door shut. The cupboards were equally depressing, a bachelor's wasteland of expired foods and empty spaces. He found an ancient box of Cheerios pushed to the back, only slightly expired. It would have to do until he could figure something else out. Derek dumped what remained of the cereal into 2 chipped bowls, wincing at how the ceramic's worn edges reflected his general state of preparedness. No milk. Of course, there was no milk. He set the bowls on his coffee table since he didn't own an actual dining table. The surface was scratched and water-stained, but it would have to serve. "Here," he said gruffly. "Sorry, it's dry." He watched them anxiously, wondering if they'd reject the sad excuse for breakfast. The twins didn't seem to mind. They perched on his couch like little birds, tiny legs dangling over the edge, and ate the stale cereal piece by piece with careful fingers. Derek made coffee, the familiar ritual helping to ground him in this unfamiliar situation. As he took his first sip of the bitter brew, he noticed Mia watching him intently, her dark eyes following his every movement. She reached toward his mug with curious fingers drawn by the steam curling up from the surface. "No," he said, moving it away quickly. "Hot. It'll hurt you." To his surprise, Mia broke into a wide smile showing tiny white teeth. Then she giggled, a sound even sweeter than her sister's had been, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and something in his chest tightened at the sound. Derek ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble there. His apartment was a disaster, looking more like a crime scene than a home. The twins were still in their thin pajamas from last night, the fabric wrinkled and bearing mysterious stains. They needed clothes, food, probably diapers. Did 3-year-olds wear diapers? He had no idea. The list of things he didn't know about childcare seemed endless and overwhelming. He watched them eat their dry cereal, these 2 tiny humans who somehow ended up in his care. Their dark curls were wild from sleep, their feet still bare and looking impossibly small against his worn couch cushions. They seemed so delicate, so vulnerable, and he was completely, utterly unprepared for the responsibility that had landed in his lap. Derek exhaled heavily, the sound loud in the quiet apartment. There was no way around it. He needed help, real help. He couldn't wing this one, not when the stakes were so high. These little girls deserved better than his fumbling attempts at caregiving. The hospital parking lot stretched before Derek like a concrete desert, the morning sun harsh against the windshield. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, questioning every decision that had led him here. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. In the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of the twins in his back seat, Tia holding Mia's hand, both silent and solemn, their matching blue dresses wrinkled from sleep. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than them. "Let's see your Nana." The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a blast of cold air that smelled of bleach and illness. Derek's boots squeaked against the polished floor as he led the girls inside, one tiny hand in each of his. Their small fingers clutched his tightly, seeking comfort. The emergency wing buzzed with the usual morning chaos, nurses rushing past with charts, worried families huddled in corners, the constant beeping of machines echoing off the sterile walls. A nurse looked up from her station, her eyes widening in recognition. "Officer Patterson?" She stood, smoothing her scrubs, her kind face creased with concern. "I'm Nurse Carla. You brought in those twins last night?" Derek nodded stiffly. Standing here without his uniform felt wrong, like he was playing a part he didn't know the lines to. His casual clothes made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Carla's face softened as she looked at the girls. "Delilah's still unconscious. We've got her stabilized, but..." She shook her head, choosing her words carefully. "No guarantees yet. The next 24 hours will be crucial." The twins stared up at him, their dark eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. His throat felt tight as he guided them toward room 204, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The steady beep of monitors grew louder with each step, a rhythm that matched his pounding heart. Inside, Delilah lay still as stone, tubes and wires creating a web around her frail body. Her skin looked paper-thin in the fluorescent light, her chest barely rising with each breath. Gray hair fanned across the stark white pillow like a silver halo. The twins stopped dead in the doorway, their small bodies pressing against his legs. Mia's hand slipped from his grip. She moved forward slowly like she was approaching a sleeping bird and reached for her grandmother's limp hand. Her tiny fingers wrapped around Delilah's weathered ones, careful to avoid the IV line. "Nana?" The word came out as barely a whisper, trembling with fear and hope. Derek felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built years ago beginning to crumble. He'd seen countless victims in hospital beds, but this was different. This wasn't just another case file. These weren't just another set of faces he could forget about when his shift ended. These were real people who needed him. Nurse Carla appeared beside him, arms crossed. "You're attached to them already, aren't you?" Her voice was gentle but knowing, filled with years of watching similar scenes unfold. Derek kept his eyes on the twins, watching as Tia joined her sister at the bedside. They looked so small next to that hospital bed, so vulnerable. Their matching dark braids hung down their backs, slightly messy from sleep. "I won't let them disappear into the system," he muttered, the words coming out before he could stop them. The thought of these girls being separated, shipped off to different foster homes, made his stomach turn. Carla raised an eyebrow. "You willing to fight for them?" Derek exhaled slowly, watching as Mia stroked her grandmother's hand with careful tenderness. Tia reached up to adjust the blanket over Delilah's shoulders, her small face set with determination. He didn't know the answer to that question. Not yet. But something deep inside him was shifting, changing, like ice beginning to thaw. The sharp knock on Derek's apartment door made both twins jump. They'd been sitting on the floor, completely fascinated by his shoelaces, giggling as they pulled them loose. Derek's jaw tightened. He knew that precise, demanding knock. Ms. Hayes stood in the hallway, her navy suit as crisp as her expression. Her heels clicked against the worn floor as she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes swept the apartment, taking in every detail. The unwashed coffee mug in the sink, the blanket hastily folded on the couch, the general bachelor pad disorder that screamed, "Not child-ready." "Officer Patterson," she said, her voice clipped. "I see you've made yourself comfortable with our charges." Her tone conveyed a sense of disapproval, as if Derek had no right to be caring for the twins. Derek crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of defiance. "To remind you that this situation is temporary. You have no legal standing here." She tapped her clipboard, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. "These children need proper placement with certified foster parents." As if on cue, Mia scrambled over and wrapped herself around Derek's leg, her tiny fingers digging into his jeans. Tia wasn't far behind, peeking out from behind him with wide, frightened eyes, seeking the safety and comfort he had provided them. "Look at them," Ms. Hayes sighed, her expression betraying a hint of exasperation. "They're already forming an unhealthy attachment. The longer you keep them here, the harder the transition will be." Derek felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. These little girls had sought him out, and somehow they knew he would help them. He wasn't about to let them down. "If you don't bring them in voluntarily," Ms. Hayes continued, her voice firm, "we'll have to escalate this. There are protocols, Officer Patterson. Surely you understand protocols." Derek looked down at Mia, still clinging to his leg, and then at Tia, who had edged forward just enough to grab the back of his shirt. He knew in that moment that he couldn't let them go, not when they had placed their trust in him. Then he looked back at Ms. Hayes, who stood there expecting him to simply hand the twins over as if they were lost property. His answer was simple, firm, "No." Ms. Hayes' lips pressed into a thin line, her disapproval evident. "You're not equipped for this. No toys, No proper beds, no experience with children. This apartment isn't suitable. I'll get what they need. Derek cut her off, his voice resolute. This isn't a game, Officer Patterson. These children require stability, routine, proper care. They need to stay together, he growled, his protective instinct flaring up once more. And they need someone who actually gives a damn about what happens to them. Ms. Hayes shook her head, her expression a mixture of frustration and what might have been a hint of grudging respect. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Derek felt Mia's grip tighten on his leg, and he knew he couldn't let her and Tia down. He didn't care if he was making things harder for Ms. Hayes or the system. These girls weren't going anywhere, not if he had anything to say about it. Derek shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair, its smooth surface squeaking beneath him. The law office smelled of old books and coffee, with sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Attorney Lisa Carter sat across from him, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she flipped through a thick manila folder, the pages rustling in the quiet room. "You want emergency custody?" she asked, looking up at him with raised eyebrows, her expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Of twin 3-year-olds? Yes." Derek's voice was firm, though his stomach churned with anxiety he refused to show. Ms. Hayes stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly against her navy blue blazer. "This is highly irregular, Ms. Carter. Officer Patterson has no prior relationship with these children. He's not family, not even close." Lisa ignored her, focusing on Derek. "You're a single police officer working irregular hours, no childcare experience, no family support system." She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. "What makes you think you can do this?" Derek uncrossed his arms, leaning forward with intensity in his eyes. "Because I have to." His voice was quiet but determined, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Those girls trust me. They need someone who'll keep them together. You should see how they hold hands when they're scared." "There are plenty of qualified foster families," Ms. Hayes started, her tone clipped and professional. "Who'll separate them?" Derek cut in, his jaw tightening. "They've already lost their grandmother. They shouldn't lose each other too. They're all they have left." Lisa studied him for a long moment, then sighed, removing her glasses to rub the bridge of her nose. "It's a long shot. The courts prefer established families, blood relatives." "Their grandmother saved my life when I was a kid," Derek blurted out, the words rushing forth before he could stop them. Both women turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. "Delilah Carter. She stopped my father from—" He swallowed hard, old memories surfacing. "She called the police. Got me help. I never forgot that. Never will." Lisa's expression softened slightly, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's interesting context." She drummed her fingers on the desk thoughtfully. "I'll file the paperwork, but temporary custody is the best we can hope for right now. There will be home visits, background checks, interviews. It won't be easy." "Whatever it takes," Derek said, his shoulders squared with determination. Ms. Hayes stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "I'll be opposing this petition. These children need stability, not a bachelor cop's apartment and irregular schedules." "File your opposition then," Lisa replied calmly, pulling out forms from her desk drawer. "Let the judge decide." The next hour passed in a blur of signatures and legal terms that made Derek's head spin. His hand cramped from signing paper after paper. Finally, Lisa stood up, straightening her suit jacket. "The emergency hearing is in an hour. Judge Martinez usually grants temporary custody pending full investigation, but don't get too confident. This is just the beginning." Derek nodded, his throat tight with anticipation. In the courtroom, he stood straight-backed as Lisa presented their case, his police training helping him maintain his composure. Ms. Hayes argued against it, citing his lack of experience and resources, her voice sharp with disapproval. The judge listened to both sides, his expression unreadable, then cleared his throat. Given the unique circumstances and the children's apparent bond with Officer Patterson, I'm granting temporary custody pending full investigation. The gavel struck with finality, the sound echoing through the courtroom. Back in Lisa's office, Derek stared at the custody papers in his hands, the official seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The weight of what he'd just done hit him like a physical force, making his hands tremble slightly. He'd just become a father, overnight, to twins. The responsibility felt overwhelming. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now?" Lisa gathered her files, offering him a gentle smile. "Now you go home and take care of your girls." Your girls. The words echoed in his head as he stood up on slightly shaky legs. His girls. He was really doing this. There was no turning back now, and somehow that thought was both terrifying and exactly right. Something was poking Derek's cheek. His police instincts kicked in, but his body felt heavy with exhaustion. Slowly, he opened his eyes to find two tiny faces hovering inches from his, their warm breath tickling his skin. Jesus. He jerked upright on the couch, his heart racing. The twins stepped back, their big brown eyes watching him intently, like two curious owls. For a moment, he just stared at them, remembering everything that had happened. The alley, the hospital, the custody papers. It felt like a dream, but the reality was right here in front of him. A loud clatter from the kitchen snapped him fully awake. Mia had wandered off and was sitting on his kitchen floor, surrounded by pots and pans she'd pulled from the lower cabinets. The metal cookware formed a chaotic circle around her small frame. She had one of his metal spoons in her mouth, drooling all over it and looking entirely pleased with herself. No, don't put that in your mouth." Derek scrambled up, his sock-clad feet sliding on the hardwood floor, but then noticed Tia trying to pull open his refrigerator door with determined little fingers. "Hold on. Wait." The apartment was a disaster zone. How long had they been awake? Cheerios were scattered across the floor like tiny landmines, crunching under his feet. One of his kitchen drawers hung open, its contents spilled out in a jumbled mess of utensils. His coffee table magazines were strewn everywhere, pages crumpled and torn. A half-empty sippy cup he didn't even remember getting lay on its side near the TV stand. Derek ran his hands through his disheveled hair, trying to think straight through the fog of morning confusion. Food. Kids needed food. That was basic, right? He stumbled to the kitchen, gently taking the spoon from Mia's mouth. She didn't cry or resist, just blinked up at him with those huge eyes that seemed to see right through him. Opening his cabinets revealed nothing but a half-empty box of stale Cheerios and some crackers that were probably older than the twins. The fridge was worse. A six-pack of beer, old takeout containers with questionable contents, and a carton of milk he was afraid to smell. His bachelor lifestyle suddenly seemed painfully inadequate. Okay, he muttered, dumping some Cheerios into 2 coffee mugs since he didn't own any proper bowls. The ceramic mugs looked comically large in comparison to their tiny hands. "Here, it's not much, but..." He trailed off, feeling like he should apologize for not having proper kid food. The girls didn't complain or throw tantrums like he half expected. They just sat right there on his kitchen floor, their little legs crossed, picking at the dry cereal with their tiny fingers. Their acceptance of the situation made his heart twist. Derek started his coffee maker, the familiar routine helping him feel slightly more normal in this surreal morning. As the coffee brewed, filling the apartment with its rich aroma, he watched them eat. They were so small, so vulnerable. Their dark curls were messy from sleep, their borrowed t-shirts hanging like dresses on their tiny frames. What the hell was he thinking, bringing them here? He didn't know the first thing about taking care of kids. He could barely take care of himself most days. The coffee maker beeped and he poured himself a cup, desperately needing the caffeine to face whatever this day would bring. Suddenly, Mia was there beside him, reaching for his mug with both hands, her face eager and curious. "Whoa!" Derek pulled the hot coffee away just in time, his heart jumping. "No way, kiddo, that's not for..." But Mia giggled, actually giggled. The sound was like bells, pure and sweet, echoing through the apartment. Then Tia started giggling too, and for a moment his cramped apartment was filled with the sound of their laughter, bright and infectious in the morning light. Derek felt something in his chest loosen, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with coffee. He sank down onto the couch, still holding his coffee out of reach, watching as the girls went back to their Cheerios. They kept glancing at him and breaking into fresh giggles, sharing some private joke he couldn't understand. He rubbed his temples, trying to think through his growing mental checklist. They needed real food, clothes that actually fit, toys probably, a routine, structure, all those things kids were supposed to have. He had none of it. His apartment, perfect for a single cop who was barely home, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for two small children. Looking around his messy apartment, at these two little girls who somehow trusted him completely despite his obvious shortcomings, Derek felt completely overwhelmed. He had no clue what he was doing, but watching them eat their dry cereal without complaint, occasionally sharing secret smiles with each other, their resilience touching something deep inside him, he knew one thing for certain. He was going to figure it out. These girls deserved nothing less. The smell of burning toast filled Derek's small apartment as he stood at the stove, desperately trying to salvage what was supposed to be a simple breakfast. He'd already ruined 2 pieces, and the third wasn't looking much better. Behind him, Mia and Tia sat at his tiny kitchen table, their little legs swinging back and forth as they watched his futile culinary struggle with curious, innocent expressions. Suddenly, Derek's phone buzzed loudly against the counter, making him jump in surprise. When he saw the caller ID, his stomach dropped. It was Sergeant Bill Reynolds, his superior officer. Derek stared at the screen, letting it ring twice more before finally mustering the courage to answer. "Patterson," he said, keeping his voice as neutral as possible, trying to mask the growing sense of dread. "Where the hell have you been?" Reynolds' gruff, disapproving voice came through the line immediately. "You called in sick. That's not like you at all." Derek turned away from the girls, lowering his voice to a quiet murmur. "Just dealing with something personal, Sarge." "Personal?" Reynolds scoffed, the skepticism evident in his tone. "Social services called the precinct asking about you. What's this about you taking custody of 2 kids?" Derek's jaw tightened and he could feel the weight of the sergeant's disapproval bearing down on him. "I didn't plan on it," he admitted, knowing his superior would not approve. "Then let them go before this turns into something you can't walk away from," Reynolds said, his tone sharp and uncompromising. "You're a good cop, Patterson. Don't throw away your career over this." The toast popped up black as charcoal, but Derek barely noticed. He was too focused on the conversation and the implications it held for his future. "It's not that simple," Derek replied, his voice tinged with a hint of desperation. "It is that simple. Let social services do their job." Reynolds' words were laced with a clear warning. Behind him, Derek heard the scrape of Mia's chair against the floor. When he glanced back, both girls were watching him intently, their expressions a mix of worry and uncertainty. Tia's lower lip trembled slightly, betraying her unease. "I'll check in later," Derek said firmly, determined to end the conversation on his own terms. "Patterson," Reynolds began, but Derek didn't let him finish. "Later, Sarge," he said, and then promptly switched off his phone, cutting off any further protest from his superior. Before Derek could even move, Tia was at his side, tugging on his sleeve with a trembling hand. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight of uncertainty that tugged at his heart. "Are we bad?" The question hit Derek like a punch to the gut, and he felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He quickly knelt down beside Tia, putting himself at eye level with both girls, wanting to reassure them and erase the worry from their faces. "No," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "You're not bad. Not at all." Tia's fingers were still wrapped tightly in the fabric of his sleeve, as if she were afraid he might disappear. Mia slid off her chair and came closer, standing shoulder to shoulder with her sister. They both looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes that somehow seemed to see right through him, straight to the core of his being. Derek felt something twist painfully in his chest. These girls needed stability, certainty, and a sense of belonging. Instead, he was keeping them in a state of limbo, hiding out in his apartment while the world tried to pull them away. He couldn't keep doing this forever, and the realization weighed heavily on him. He knew he had to find a way to provide the security and love these children so desperately needed. Derek sat in his parked car outside the supermarket, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The thought of taking 2 toddlers grocery shopping made his stomach churn. He'd faced armed suspects with less anxiety. His tactical training had prepared him for countless dangerous situations, but nothing had readied him for this. "All right, in and out. We grab what we need, no problems." He glanced in the rearview mirror. Mia had her face pressed against the window, totally captivated by a fat pigeon strutting across the parking lot. Her breath left little foggy patches on the glass. Tia was contentedly chewing on the string of the oversized hoodie he'd given her to wear, the gray fabric practically swallowing her tiny frame. He let out a heavy sigh. This is going to be a disaster. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify everything, from the squeaking shopping carts to the tinny muzak playing overhead. The twins stuck to him like barnacles, tiny hands clutching his jeans as they walked, their fingers leaving little wrinkles in the fabric. Their eyes were wide, taking in the towering shelves and colorful displays. Mia reached out to touch every package within reach, her small fingers leaving prints on the shiny wrappers, while Tia kept tilting her head back to stare at the ceiling lights, nearly tripping over her own feet in wonder. Derek grabbed a cart, lifting both girls to sit in the double seat. Their little legs dangled as he secured them. "Okay, He realized he had no idea what kids ate. His own childhood meals were better left forgotten. "Food. We need food." They rolled past the produce section where Mia pointed excitedly at some bananas. "Those!" Her face lit up at the yellow fruit. At least that seemed healthy. Into the cart they went. Tia spotted boxes of sugary cereal and bounced in her seat, making the whole cart shake. "That one?" "The purple one." "Fine, but you have to eat real food too," Derek muttered, grabbing the cereal along with some bread and milk. He tried to remember what normal families bought at grocery stores. The girls gasped in unison when they reached the toy aisle. A wall of stuffed animals stared back at them with button eyes, their plush faces seeming to beckon the twins. Derek tried to steer the cart past, but their pleading looks stopped him, 2 pairs of hopeful eyes that made his resolve crumble. He sighed. 1 each. That's it. Mia chose a floppy-eared rabbit with soft brown fur, while Tia grabbed a pink elephant with a polka-dotted bow. They hugged their new treasures tight as Derek continued shopping, tossing in whatever looked remotely kid-appropriate. Juice boxes, crackers, fruit cups, chicken nuggets. He noticed how they held the toys like lifelines, probably the first new things they'd had in a while. At the checkout, the cashier, a grandmother type with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, rang up their odd assortment of items. She smiled warmly at the twins, who were still clutching their stuffed animals, their small faces peeking over the shopping cart handle. "Your daughters are adorable." Derek froze. The word daughters hit him like a punch to the gut, sending a jolt through his entire body. He stood there, mouth slightly open, too long before managing to respond. The concept of being anyone's father had never crossed his mind until now. "Something like that," he muttered, handing over his credit card with slightly trembling fingers. Derek stood at his small stove, stirring a pot of spaghetti with more concentration than the task probably required. The sauce bubbled dangerously close to the rim, threatening to spill over at any moment. He'd never cooked for anyone but himself before, and even that was usually takeout or microwave meals. The thought of messing up their first real meal together made his hands unusually clumsy. Behind him, soft giggles floated from the living room floor where the twins sat playing with their new stuffed animals, a purple elephant and a spotted giraffe they'd picked out at the store. The sound made something warm stir in his chest, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. He caught himself smiling without meaning to, which only confused him more. As he watched them play, arranging their toys in careful patterns on his worn carpet, a sudden thought hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't even know their names. Here he was, fighting to keep them, and he hadn't even asked the most basic question. The realization made him feel like the worst kind of fool. He turned off the stove and lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the floor near them, his joints protesting the unfamiliar position. "All right, we should probably fix something. I can't keep calling you kid and you." His gruff voice came out gentler than he'd intended. The smaller girl, the quiet one, looked up at him with those big brown eyes that seemed to see right through him. She reached into her tiny backpack and pulled out a crumpled sticky note, handling it like it was precious. With careful movements, she pressed it onto his chest. In wobbly, childish handwriting, it read, "Mia." Her sister held up 2 fingers, then pointed at herself, bouncing slightly where she sat. Her eyes sparkled with intelligence and a hint of mischief. Derek raised an eyebrow. "Tia?" She nodded enthusiastically, hugging her elephant closer until its trunk squished against her cheek. "Mia and Tia," he said softly, testing the names on his tongue. They felt right somehow, like pieces clicking into place. The girls beamed at him, and that warm feeling in his chest grew stronger, spreading through his whole body. After dinner, which wasn't completely burnt, though the sauce was a bit too thick, they curled up on his bed with their new stuffed animals. He'd tried to put them on the couch, but they'd followed him to his room like little shadows, their bare feet padding silently across the floor. Within minutes, they were fast asleep, Mia clutching her giraffe, and Tia sprawled out with her elephant, their breathing deep and peaceful. Derek made his way back to the living room and sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. The weight of everything was starting to sink in. These weren't just random kids anymore. They were Mia and Tia. They had names, personalities, favorite stuffed animals. They were real little people who somehow trusted him completely. He stared at the ceiling, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet apartment. What the hell am I doing? The question hung in the air, unanswered, while somewhere in his chest, that warm feeling refused to go away. The hospital corridor stretched before them, its harsh fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on the polished linoleum floor. Derek felt the twins' tiny hands gripping his fingers as they walked, Mia on his left, Tia on his right. Their footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, punctuated only by the distant beeping of medical equipment and the occasional muffled voice from a nearby room. "Morning, Officer Patterson," Nurse Carla called out softly from her station, her voice low and soothing. Her eyes softened with empathy at the sight of the 2 young girls clinging to Derek's sides. "She's stable. No change yet, but the doctors are hopeful." Derek nodded, his expression grim as he gently guided the twins toward room 214. The girls grew quieter with each step, their grip on his hands tightening. They knew what waited for them behind that door, their beloved grandmother, Delilah, fighting for her life. Inside the dimly lit room, Delilah lay still and pale, surrounded by the quiet hum of medical equipment. Her silver hair spread across the white pillow like a halo, her dark skin ashen against the stark hospital sheets. An oxygen mask covered the lower half of her face, and thin IV lines snaked from her arms. Mia was the first to let go of Derek's hand. With careful, reverent movements, she stepped forward and placed the new stuffed bear, a brown teddy with a red bow that she had picked out at the store just the day before, next to Delilah's motionless hand on the bed. The simple gesture hit Derek hard, tugging at his heart and pulling him back through the decades to a time long buried. He was 10 years old again, crouched in a grocery store parking lot, tasting the metallic tang of blood in his mouth as his father's shadow loomed over him, fist raised. Then came Delilah's voice, sharp and unwavering, cutting through the haze of fear. "That's enough." She had stepped between them, this stranger who refused to look away. "You're not alone," she'd told him later, after the police came, her hand warm and steady on his shoulder as she waited with him until social services arrived. Derek blinked, returning to the present. Tia had now joined her sister, both girls standing close to their grandmother's bedside, their faces etched with a weight no 3-year-olds should have to bear. They weren't crying, but the worry and uncertainty in their eyes was heartbreaking to witness. "You saved me," Derek whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he looked at Delilah's still form, remembering how she had stepped in without hesitation to protect him all those years ago. Now it's my turn. Nurse Carla appeared in the doorway carrying a fresh pitcher of water for Delilah's bedside table. She paused, taking in the scene, the tough, hardened cop standing guard over two tiny, vulnerable girls, the stuffed bear keeping silent vigil. "The doctors say the next 24 hours are critical," she said quietly. "But she's fighting. Delilah's a strong one." Derek nodded, his jaw set with determination. He looked down at the twins, then back at Delilah's still form. The choice had already been made, really. He wasn't walking away. Not from these girls. Not from the woman who had saved him when no one else would. The kitchen light cast a soft glow across Derek's apartment as he scrubbed the last pot clean. His shoulders ached from the day's tension, and dirty water dripped down his forearms. The twins' dinner plates were already dry in the rack. They'd eaten everything he'd made, even the slightly burnt parts. Behind him, Mia and Tia sat cross-legged on the living room floor, whispering to their new stuffed animals. Mia had picked a floppy-eared rabbit, while Tia chose a round-bellied penguin. The sight of them playing quietly made something in Derek's chest loosen just a bit. He dried his hands on a dish towel and reached for the fridge, grabbing a beer. The day had been long. Too many questions from too many people about what he was doing with these kids. He just needed a moment to... A small tug at his pant leg made him look down. Tia stood there, arms stretched high above her head, staring up at him with those big brown eyes. "What?" he muttered, beer still in hand. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed onto his leg and started climbing. Before Derek could react, she'd scrambled up and plopped herself right in his lap, her tiny body warm against his chest. Derek froze. His arms hovered awkwardly, not sure where to put them. He'd never held a kid like this before. What if he did it wrong? What if he hurt her? From the couch, Mia watched intently, her rabbit clutched tight. Her eyes darted between Derek and her sister, measuring, waiting. Derek exhaled slowly and forced his shoulders to relax. "All right, kid," he murmured, carefully settling one arm around Tia. She immediately snuggled closer, her head tucking under his chin. That seemed to be what Mia was waiting for. She slid off the couch and padded over, Penguin dragging behind her. Without a word, she climbed up too, fitting herself against his other side. Derek sat very still, feeling their small bodies grow heavy with sleep. Tia's breath came in tiny puffs against his neck. Mia's hand clutched his shirt, her stuffed animal squished between them. These weren't just two scared kids anymore. They trusted him. They felt safe with him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He looked down at their peaceful faces, something fierce and protective rising in his chest. These girls needed him. And maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. His beer sat forgotten on the counter, warming in the kitchen light. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Derek pushed through the precinct's heavy glass doors. The familiar smell of stale coffee and old paperwork hit him immediately. Officers bustled around, phones rang, and keyboards clicked. The usual morning chaos. But something felt off. Sergeant Bill Reynolds stood by the front desk, arms crossed tight over his chest. His face was set in that stern expression Derek knew too well from their 15 years working together. The moment their eyes met, Derek's stomach clenched. "You need to come with me," Reynolds said, his voice low and controlled. Derek followed him down the narrow hallway, past the break room where he'd spent countless hours trading war stories with fellow officers. Now those same officers watched him pass with curious eyes. Reynolds stopped at a door Derek had never entered before, Internal Affairs. Inside, a man in a crisp suit sat behind a metal desk. His badge gleamed under the harsh lighting. "Officer Patterson," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "Please sit." Derek remained standing. "What's this about?" "We need to discuss your recent conduct." The Internal Affairs officer shuffled through some papers. "Specifically, your decision to take 2 minors into your custody without following proper protocols. I prevented them from being separated in the system," Derek said flatly. "Social Services has filed a formal concern." The officer's voice was cold, professional. You've overstepped your authority. These actions could have serious consequences for your career. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice softer. Look, Derek, I get it. You want to help, but this isn't the way. They're not yours. Derek's jaw tightened. Watch me. This isn't a game, the internal affairs officer cut in. If you continue interfering with social services procedures, we'll have no choice but to take disciplinary action. Your job is at stake here. Derek thought about Mia and Tia, how they'd curled up against him last night, finally feeling safe enough to sleep deeply. How Mia had started humming while coloring this morning. How Tia had actually smiled at breakfast. Are we done here? Derek asked. The internal affairs officer frowned. Officer Patterson, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. Derek turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, Reynolds called out, Don't throw your whole life away for this. Derek's hand paused on the doorknob. 15 years on the force. His whole identity wrapped up in this job. But he thought about those girls, about Delilah lying in that hospital bed, about promises and second chances. He walked out without another word. Derek stirred the pot of chicken noodle soup, watching the steam rise in lazy swirls. The apartment was quiet except for the soft scratching of pen on paper and the occasional giggle from the twins. He'd found the broken ballpoint pen in his jacket pocket, and some napkins from their takeout dinner the night before had become impromptu drawing paper. He glanced over his shoulder at Mia and Tia, both hunched over the small kitchen table, their heads nearly touching as they worked intently on their masterpieces. Their faces wore identical expressions of concentration, tongues poking out slightly at the corners of their mouths. Almost ready, Derek announced, tapping the wooden spoon on the pot's edge. You two hungry? Tia nodded without looking up, her small hand gripping the pen awkwardly as she made another mark on her napkin. Mia simply continued drawing, completely absorbed in her work. Derek grabbed 3 mismatched bowls from the cabinet. They'd bought them at the dollar store yesterday after he realized he only owned 2 bowls total. As he ladled the soup, he noticed the twins had stopped drawing and were now holding up their napkins, examining their work with serious expressions. What have you got there? He asked, setting their bowls down carefully. Mia pushed her napkin toward him first. Derek picked it up, and his breath caught in his throat. 3 stick figures stood hand in hand, one tall one in the middle, wearing what looked like a police badge, and 2 smaller ones on either side. Above them was a wobbly rectangle that he assumed was meant to be his apartment. That's you, Mia said softly, pointing to the tall figure. And that's me and Tia. Tia thrust her napkin forward next. Her drawing showed the same 3 figures, but they were sitting at what appeared to be their kitchen table, surrounded by squiggly lines that might have been steam from soup bowls. Derek stared at the drawings, something tight forming in his chest. These weren't just random scribbles. These were pictures of them together, as a family. You be our deck forever, Mia asked suddenly, her dark eyes serious and hopeful. The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Derek opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wanted to say yes. God, how he wanted to say yes. But the reality of their situation pressed down on him. The temporary custody, social services breathing down his neck, his job hanging by a thread. He cleared his throat. Eat your soup, he said instead, turning away to grab spoons from the drawer. His hands were shaking slightly as he set them down. The twins didn't seem bothered by his non-answer, happily digging into their dinner. Derek watched them eat, their little legs swinging under the table, occasionally trading glances and giggling at some private joke between them. He just started gathering the empty bowls when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. Social services. Derek opened his door expecting the Amazon package he'd ordered, clothes and toys for the girls. Instead, his heart stopped. Ms. Hayes stood there, her face set in grim determination. 2 uniformed officers flanked her sides. He recognized them both, Johnson and Martinez from the night shift. Officer Patterson, Ms. Hayes said, her voice clipped and professional. We need to take the girls. Derek's whole body went rigid, Behind him, he could hear Mia and Tia playing with their stuffed animals, completely unaware. "No way in hell," he growled, filling the doorframe with his body. Ms. Hayes sighed, pulling out a document. "There's been a clerical error. Your temporary custody was never properly finalized. Legally, they can't stay here." "Deck?" Tia's small voice came from behind him. She peeked around his leg, her eyes growing wide at the sight of strangers. Mia appeared next to her sister, gripping her stuffed bear tightly. "It's okay," Derek said, but his voice cracked. He knew it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. "No!" Tia screamed, wrapping herself around his leg. Mia started crying, big silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Officer Johnson stepped forward, his face sympathetic but determined. "Come on, Derek. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Martinez moved in, gently trying to untangle Tia from Derek's leg. The little girl's screams grew louder. "No! No, Deck!" Derek's fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Every instinct told him to fight, to protect them. But he knew. He knew if he resisted, if he fought back, he'd lose any chance of getting them back legally. Mia reached for him as Martinez picked her up. Her small hand stretched toward him, her bear falling to the floor. "Deck, please." The sound of their screams echoed through the hallway as Ms. Hayes led them away. Derek stood frozen, watching as they disappeared around the corner. The door closed with a soft click that felt like a gunshot. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek sank onto his couch, staring at the empty room. Their drawings still covered his coffee table. The half-eaten breakfast dishes sat in the sink. Mia's fallen bear lay abandoned by the door. He'd never felt emptier in his life. The silence in Derek's apartment was deafening. At 3 a.m., he sat motionless on his couch, staring at the empty spot where Mia and Tia usually curled up together. Their absence felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. His eyes caught something small and fuzzy poking out from under the coffee table. Mia's stuffed bear dropped in the chaos when they were taken away. He reached down and picked it up, his fingers tightening around the soft fabric. The apartment felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The usual nighttime sounds, traffic outside, his neighbor's TV, the hum of his refrigerator, seemed muffled and distant. All he could hear was the echo of the twins' screams as they were pulled away from him. Derek stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced the small living room, his footsteps heavy on the worn carpet. His body thrummed with restless energy, anger and helplessness churning in his gut. His eyes drifted to the kitchen where a six-pack sat in the fridge. The old familiar urge to drink until he couldn't feel anything anymore pulled at him. But he stopped himself, jaw clenching. Drinking wouldn't fix this, it wouldn't bring them back. He tried lying down on the couch, closing his eyes, forcing himself to rest. But every time he did, he saw their faces. Tia reaching for him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mia's silent, betrayed look as she was carried away. He sat up again, running his hands through his hair in frustration. The emptiness drove him to their room, really just a corner of his bedroom where he'd set up their little sleeping area. Their blankets were still rumpled from their afternoon nap. A half-finished coloring book lay open on the floor, crayon marks trailing off the page where Tia had gotten distracted. Back in the kitchen, their drawings were still scattered across the table. Simple stick figures holding hands, him in the middle, Mia and Tia on either side. "Our family," written in wobbly letters across the top. Derek picked up one of the drawings, his throat tight. He felt completely powerless. They trusted him to protect them, and he'd failed. But something shifted inside him as he stood there, holding their drawing in one hand and Mia's bear in the other. A familiar determination settled over him, the same feeling he got when working a case he refused to give up on. He wouldn't let them disappear into the system. He wouldn't let them be separated. He'd made them a promise, even if he hadn't said it out loud. Derek's jaw clenched as he gripped the stuffed bear. No more playing by the rules. No more letting the system dictate what happened to these girls. He was going to fight, really fight, to get them back. Derek strode into the police station, his jaw set and shoulders rigid. The familiar smell of coffee and paper files did nothing to calm his nerves. Officers nodded at him as he passed. but he barely noticed them. His focus was laser-sharp, fixed on one goal. Sergeant Reynolds spotted him coming through the bullpen and shook his head. "Don't do this, Patterson." His voice carried a warning, but Derek walked right past him. Reynolds followed, muttering under his breath. They entered his office, and Reynolds shut the door with a soft click. The small room felt suffocating, with its outdated filing cabinets and harsh fluorescent lighting. "Those girls are not yours," Reynolds said, leaning against his desk. "I know you think you're helping, but—" Derek's fist crashed down on the desk, making coffee mugs rattle. "They were safer with me than in some damn shelter." His voice was raw with emotion. "You didn't see how they were living. You didn't see their faces when they were taken." "Doesn't matter." Reynolds rubbed his temples. "The law is the law. You can't just decide to keep 2 kids because you feel like it." Derek took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His hands were shaking. "Then I'll fight the law." Reynolds studied him for a long moment. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter. "You willing to lose your job over this?" Derek didn't even pause. "If that's what it takes." 15 years on the force, Reynolds said, shaking his head. "You're going to throw it all away for 2 kids you barely know?" "I know enough." Derek's voice was firm. "I know they trust me. I know they're scared, and I know the system will eat them alive." Reynolds sank into his chair, looking suddenly tired. "You're making a mistake, Patterson. A career-ending mistake." "Maybe." Derek straightened his shoulders. "But it's my mistake to make." Reynolds stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed heavily. "You need a damn good lawyer." Derek turned toward the door, his hand on the knob. He knew exactly where to start. Without another word, he walked out of the office, leaving Reynolds shaking his head behind him. The other officers watched him go, but Derek didn't care. His mind was already racing ahead, forming a plan. He'd promised those girls he wouldn't let them disappear into the system, and Derek Patterson kept his promises. Derek sat stiffly in the leather chair, his uniform feeling too tight around his neck. The law office smelled of leather and lemon polish, everything neat and orderly, the complete opposite of his life right now. Lisa Carter studied him from behind her mahogany desk, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "So let me get this straight. You're trying to get custody of 2 kids who aren't related to you?" Her tone was more curious than judgmental. "Yes." Derek's voice was firm. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "And you're a single cop with no prior guardianship experience?" "Yes." She exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. "This is an uphill battle, Patterson. The system isn't built for cases like this." Derek leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I don't care how hard it is. Tell me what I have to do." Lisa pulled out a legal pad, her red pen tapping against the yellow paper. "Let's lay out what we're up against. First, you have no legal relation to these children. That's a major hurdle. The system heavily favors blood relatives." "They don't have any other relatives," Derek cut in. "Second," Lisa continued, "you're single. Foster system strongly prefers 2-parent households. They believe it provides more stability." Derek's jaw tightened. "Those girls were more stable with me for a few days than they've been since they were taken." "Third," Lisa held up another finger, "your job as a cop. Long hours, dangerous work, irregular schedule. The court might see that as unstable for young children." Derek stayed silent, absorbing each blow. His fingers dug into his palms. Lisa studied him carefully, her expression softening slightly. "You sure about this? Once we start, there's no easy way to back out." Derek met her gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Lisa nodded slowly, then reached for a thick folder. "All right, then. We'll need to file for emergency custody first. That means proving the current situation is harmful to the children." She started pulling out forms. "We'll need character references, proof of income, housing stability." "Whatever it takes," Derek said firmly. Lisa flipped open the file, her expression turning businesslike. "All right, Patterson, let's get to work." Derek watched as she began writing, feeling for the first time since the girls were taken that he might have a chance. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever was. The police archives smelled of dust and old paper, a familiar, musty scent that reminded Derek of countless hours spent filing reports. Now, surrounded by towering metal shelves filled with decades of case files, he felt like he was searching for a needle in a haystack. "You sure you want to go that far back?" The archive clerk, an older man with thick glasses, peered at him skeptically. 30-year-old files are in the basement storage. Derek nodded, his jaw set. "I need them." The basement was even mustier, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows across rows of cardboard boxes. Derek's fingers moved mechanically through file after file, his eyes scanning dates and names until they began to blur together. His phone buzzed. "Lisa. Any luck?" "Still looking," he muttered, wedging it between his ear and shoulder as he continued searching. "We need something concrete, Derek. Without proof of prior connection, the court won't—" "I know," he cut her off, pulling another box from the shelf. His hands froze as he saw the date. 1993. His heart started pounding. The files were organized by month. He flipped through them quickly, his breath catching as he found October. There it was, a domestic violence report from a grocery store parking lot. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The details hit him like a punch to the gut. Officer responding to calls about a man beating a child. Witness statement from store employee Delilah Carter. His father's name, his own name, listed as the victim. Age 10. Derek's throat tightened as he read Delilah's statement. "I saw the man striking the boy repeatedly. I intervened physically, placing myself between them until police arrived. Lisa," his voice was rough, "I found it." "What exactly?" "The report from when she saved me. Delilah Carter. She stopped my father from beating me to death in a parking lot. It's all here. Her statement, the officer's report, everything." There was a pause on the other end. "Send it to me now." Derek's hands were steady as he photographed each page. "This proves it, doesn't it? She was already my family. She saved me once." "It's something," Lisa said carefully. "It shows a prior connection, a history. It's not guaranteed, but—" Derek gripped the paper tightly, his eyes fixed on Delilah's signature at the bottom. "It's what we needed." The hospital room was eerily quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Derek paused in the doorway, the old case file clutched in his hand. Delilah Carter lay in the hospital bed, looking impossibly frail against the white sheets. But her eyes were open, alert, and fixed directly on him. "Where are my girls?" Her voice was weak but carried the weight of desperate concern. Derek's throat tightened. He stepped into the room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. Nurse Carla adjusted some monitors, giving him a sympathetic look. "They took them, didn't they?" Delilah's words were barely above a whisper. She closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her face that had nothing to do with her physical condition. Derek sat in the chair beside her bed. "I'm getting them back." He pulled out the yellowed police report, his hand slightly shaking as he handed it to her. "Remember this?" Delilah's trembling fingers traced the old paper. Her eyes widened slightly as she read. "You found this?" She looked up at him, recognition dawning in her tired eyes. "Yeah, and I'm using it." Derek leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "You saved me that day. You stopped him." "You were just a boy," Delilah whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "So scared. And now it's my turn to protect them." Derek's jaw clenched with determination. "I won't let them disappear into the system." Nurse Carla stepped forward, checking Delilah's vitals. "Try not to get too excited," she warned gently. "Your condition is still unstable." Delilah struggled to speak, each word taking visible effort. "They need you, Derek." Her hand reached for his. "Those girls. They need someone who'll fight for them." Derek gripped her hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. "Just hold on. You'll see them again. I promise." Delilah's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but a small smile touched her lips. I trust you, Derek." Her words were faint but clear. Derek stood, his chest tight with emotion. He gave her hand one final squeeze before turning to leave, more determined than ever to bring Mia and Tia home where they belonged. The courthouse's wooden benches creaked as Derek shifted uncomfortably in his suit. The formal attire felt strange after years of wearing his police uniform. His attorney, Lisa Carter, sat beside him, methodically arranging papers on the table. Across the aisle, Ms. Hayes watched them with thinly veiled disapproval, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Martinez presiding." Judge Martinez, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. "Let's begin." Lisa stood, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor, this is more than a simple custody case. Officer Patterson's connection to these children goes deeper than what appears on paper." Ms. Hayes interjected, "Your Honor, regardless of any personal attachments, Officer Patterson has no legal standing. He's a single man with a dangerous profession and no parenting experience." Derek's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. Lisa had warned him to let her handle everything. He watched as she pulled out a worn manila folder. "Your Honor," Lisa continued, "I'd like to present evidence of a prior connection." She held up the yellowed police report. 30 years ago, Delilah Carter intervened when Officer Patterson, then just a child, was being abused by his father. She saved him, she called the police, she stayed with him until help arrived. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Martinez leaned forward, examining the report. "Delilah Carter wasn't just a stranger to Derek Patterson," Lisa pressed on. "She was his first experience of what family should be. She showed him protection, compassion, and strength, the very qualities he's now showing to her granddaughters." Ms. Hayes stood. "While this is a touching story, Your Honor, it doesn't change the fact that Officer Patterson has no legal right to these children. The system exists to ensure proper placement with qualified families." "And what makes a family qualified?" Lisa countered. "Is it just paperwork and protocol? Or is it someone willing to fight for these children, to protect them, to keep them together?" Judge Martinez removed her glasses, studying Derek intently. He met her gaze, trying to convey everything he couldn't say out loud. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "This is an unusual case. I need time to review all the evidence and consider the implications carefully." Derek exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The uncertainty was almost worse than a denial. "We'll reconvene next week for my decision," Judge Martinez concluded, gathering her papers. "Court is adjourned." Derek stepped into Delilah's hospital room, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sterile walls. His court clothes felt stiff and uncomfortable, but he hadn't bothered changing. Delilah lay propped up against white pillows, looking frailer than ever, but her eyes brightened when she saw him. "I have something for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beeping of monitors. She lifted a trembling hand, pointing to the bedside drawer. Derek crossed the room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The metal drawer handle felt cold under his fingers as he pulled it open. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, its corners soft and worn. "What's this?" he asked, carefully lifting the paper. "Read it," Delilah urged, her eyes never leaving his face. Derek unfolded the letter, the paper crinkling softly between his fingers. The handwriting was neat, but faded, written in blue ink that had begun to fade. As his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. "If anything happens to me," he read aloud, his voice growing thick, "I want my girls to be raised by someone who truly loves them." He looked up at Delilah, his hands trembling slightly. This could change everything." A weak smile crossed Delilah's face. "Use it," she said, reaching for his hand. Her fingers felt paper-thin against his skin. "I wrote that the day after you found them. I knew you were meant to be their father." Derek gripped the letter tightly, careful not to crease it, This was it. The missing piece they needed. Legal proof of Delilah's wishes, written before anyone could claim she was under duress or confusion. The system, Delilah continued, each word clearly costing her effort. It would separate them. Break them. But you. She squeezed his hand weakly. You already love them like they're yours. Derek swallowed hard, fighting back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I'll bring them home, he promised, his voice rough. I swear it. Delilah's eyes filled with tears, but her smile remained steady. I know you will. She pressed something else into his palm, a small key. Everything else you need is in my safety deposit box. Birth certificates, medical records, everything. Derek pressed the letter to his chest, feeling the weight of its importance. With this and the contents of the safety deposit box, they had a real chance. More than a chance. They had hope. Bring them home, Delilah whispered, her eyes beginning to drift shut with exhaustion. Bring my babies home. Derek carefully tucked the letter into his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. The key felt warm in his palm, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. He had everything he needed now. It was time to finish this. The courthouse air felt thick with tension as Derek sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Lisa stood beside him, her posture confident but controlled. Across the aisle, Ms. Hayes adjusted her glasses, a slight smile playing at her lips. Judge Martinez settled into her chair, her dark robes rustling softly. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Ms. Hayes rose first, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the bench. Your Honor, nothing has changed, Ms. Hayes began, her voice crisp and professional. Mr. Patterson remains an unsuitable guardian. He has no experience with children, works dangerous hours, and lives in a small apartment. The system exists to protect children, not to satisfy the whims of well-meaning strangers. Derek's jaw clenched, but he remained still. Lisa squeezed his shoulder gently before standing. She carried a single envelope in her hands. Your Honor, Lisa said, her voice steady. Before you make your final decision, there's something you need to see. She approached the bench and presented Delilah's will. This was written by Delilah Carter, the girl's legal guardian. The rustling of paper filled the quiet room as Judge Martinez opened the envelope. Her eyes moved across the page, and Derek watched as her expression shifted subtly. The stern lines around her mouth softened. This will changes everything, Judge Martinez said, looking up from the paper. She removed her reading glasses, studying Derek with new interest. Ms. Carter explicitly names Officer Patterson as her chosen guardian for the children. Ms. Hayes stepped forward. Your Honor, a will doesn't automatically qualify someone for guardianship. The system has protocols, Dash. The system, Lisa interrupted firmly, exists to serve the best interests of children. And in this case, we have clear evidence of their guardian's wishes. Delilah Carter didn't choose Derek Patterson randomly. She chose him because 30 years ago he was a child she helped save. She knows his character. She trusts him with what's most precious to her. Judge Martinez leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled under her chin. The silence stretched out, heavy with possibility. Derek could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, Judge Martinez straightened. I've made my decision. The room held its breath. Derek's hands tightened into fists. He could feel every second ticking by, each one an eternity. Judge Martinez's expression remained unreadable as she prepared to deliver her ruling. Judge Martinez's voice filled the silent courtroom, each word measured and clear. I've reviewed the evidence. This case is complicated. Derek's heart hammered against his ribs as he sat perfectly still, his fists clenched so tight under the table that his nails dug into his palms. Lisa maintained her professional composure beside him, but he noticed her slight intake of breath. Ms. Hayes rose from her chair, smoothing her blazer. Your Honor, if I may. She adjusted her glasses, her voice carrying across the quiet room. Officer Patterson is an excellent officer, but raising children is different from enforcing the law. The system exists to protect children, to ensure they're placed in homes equipped to handle their needs. Derek couldn't stay silent anymore. The words burst from him, raw and honest. "I know that." His voice was gruff but steady. "But I won't fail them." He met Judge Martinez's searching gaze, refusing to look away. The judge picked up Delilah's letter, studying it one final time. The paper rustled softly in her hands. She looked up, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the courtroom. The children deserve stability. They deserve someone who fights for them. She paused, and Derek felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. "I hereby grant full legal guardianship of Mia and Tia Carter to Derek Patterson." The words hit him like a physical force. Beside him, Lisa gave a small, satisfied nod. Across the aisle, Ms. Hayes's shoulders dropped slightly, but she accepted the ruling with professional grace. Derek sat there, processing the enormity of what had just happened. The twins were his. Legally, officially his. The fight that had consumed his every waking moment was over. Judge Martinez lifted her gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, final and decisive. Derek released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the tension of weeks finally draining from his shoulders. The fight was over. The twins were his. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Derek stepped into the group home. The smell of industrial cleaner and old carpet hit him immediately. A few children's drawings hung on the walls, but they couldn't hide the institutional feel of the place. The director, a thin woman with graying hair, looked up from her desk. "Officer Patterson?" She shuffled through some papers. "We received the court order. The girls are in the playroom." Derek's heart pounded as he followed her down a narrow hallway. Through a window, he could see them, two tiny figures sitting cross-legged on a worn blue carpet. His girls. The director opened the door and Derek stepped inside. The playroom was sparse, just some well-used toys and books scattered around. Tia noticed him first. She blinked several times, as if not quite believing her eyes. Then Mia looked up from the doll she was holding and her whole face transformed. She stood up slowly, clutching her stuffed bear, the one she'd left at his apartment. "Deck?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Derek felt his throat tighten. He managed a smile. "Let's go home." For a moment, neither girl moved. Then, like a dam breaking, they both scrambled up and ran to him. Tia wrapped herself around his left leg while Mia clung to his right. He could feel them trembling. "You came back," Tia whispered into his pants leg. Derek crouched down, gathering them both into his arms. They smelled like generic soap and unfamiliar laundry detergent. "Course I did. I promised, didn't I?" The director cleared her throat softly. "There's just some final paperwork." Derek nodded, but the girls wouldn't let go of him. He ended up signing the forms with Mia still attached to his side and Tia sitting on his foot. Their few belongings fit into one small backpack. As he carried them out to his car, both girls gripped his jacket like they were afraid he might disappear. Tia pressed her face into his shoulder. Mia kept one hand firmly twisted in his collar. The drive home was quiet. In the rearview mirror, Derek watched as their eyes grew heavy. The emotional toll of the day caught up with them, and soon both girls were fast asleep in their car seats, still holding hands across the middle seat. Derek gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. This was real. After all the fighting, all the paperwork, all the doubt, they were his. Legally. Officially. Forever. He glanced in the mirror again at their peaceful faces. His daughters. The word felt strange and perfect all at once. Derek stood in the doorway of the small bedroom, watching as Mia and Tia explored their new space. He'd spent the afternoon setting up two small beds with soft blankets and pillows. Nothing fancy, but better than his old couch. The girls touched everything with wonder as if they couldn't believe it was real. "Time for bed," Derek said, his voice gentler than he'd ever heard it. The twins climbed into their beds, but their eyes stayed wide open, tracking his every movement. He could see the question in their faces, the lingering fear that this might all disappear. Tia pulled her blanket up to her chin. "We're staying?" she asked in a small voice that made his chest ache. "Forever," Derek assured her, sitting on the edge of her bed. The word felt solid, real, final. Mia sat up in her bed, clutching her stuffed bear. She reached out with her tiny hand and touched Derek's face, her fingers warm against his stubbled cheek. "Love you, Dek," she whispered. The words hit him like a physical force. His throat tightened unexpectedly, and he had to swallow hard before he could speak. In all his years, through the violence, the loneliness, the numbness, nothing had ever affected him quite like this. "Love you too, kid," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out and smoothed her hair back from her forehead. Tia wiggled closer, not wanting to be left out. "Love you three," she declared, making Derek chuckle despite the lump in his throat. "Love you three too," he said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. The girls settled back into their beds, finally letting their eyes drift closed. Their stuffed animals were tucked securely under their arms, the bear and rabbit that marked the beginning of their new life together. Derek sat there in the dim light of their nightlight, watching their small faces relax into sleep. Their breathing evened out, peaceful and trusting. These two tiny humans had completely upended his life, broken through every wall he'd built, and somehow made him whole again. He stayed there for a long time, just watching them sleep. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The apartment filled with the warm scents of cinnamon and pine, a stark contrast to the cold December night outside. Derek hadn't gone overboard with decorations. Just a small tree in the corner that twinkled with multicolored lights, and a few paper snowflakes the twins had made taped to the windows. But somehow it felt more like Christmas than any he'd ever known. Mia and Tia sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by wrapping paper, their eyes wide with wonder at each new gift. Delilah watched from her place on the couch, a thick blanket draped over her legs. Though still frail from her hospital stay, color had returned to her cheeks and her eyes sparkled with joy as she watched her granddaughters. "Nana, look!" Tia scrambled up, clutching a piece of paper in her small hands. She carefully presented it to Delilah, a crayon drawing showing 4 figures holding hands. Derek, the twins, and Delilah, all standing together under a bright yellow sun. Derek sipped his coffee, leaning against the wall, taking in the scene before him. Just months ago, his apartment had been empty, cold, lifeless. Now it was filled with giggles, toys scattered across the floor, and more love than he'd ever thought possible. Suddenly, Mia launched herself at him, climbing into his lap with a burst of laughter. "We got's a family now, Dek," she declared, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. Derek hugged her close, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair. "Yeah, we do," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Delilah caught his eye from across the room, her smile knowing and warm. She had saved him all those years ago, and now here they were, full circle. The twins were safe, loved, protected. They belonged. The scene settled into a peaceful tableau, Derek holding Mia, Tia curled up next to Delilah on the couch, the Christmas tree casting soft light across their faces. For the first time in his life, Derek knew with absolute certainty. He was home. Sometimes family isn't given, it's found, and once you find it, you never let go. If you enjoyed the story of Derek, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.